Have you ever experienced the painful feeling of someone you deeply cared about suddenly disappearing without warning, leaving you wondering what went wrong, only for them to unexpectedly return as if they had never really left? It creates a confusing emotional experience. They seem completely gone, yet somehow they continue existing in the background of your life through memories, lingering emotions, or even the smallest reminders on your phone. If you've ever been close to someone with an avoidant attachment style, this pattern may feel painfully familiar. They create distance, shut down emotionally, and build walls that seem impossible to break through. Yet despite all of that, they often continue pursuing the people they care about in ways that are so quiet and indirect, they're easy to miss. Today, we're exploring the hidden ways avoidant people continue chasing meaningful connections, even when it looks like they've completely walked away. Once you recognize these behaviors, many of the mixed signals that once left you confused may finally begin making sense. Stay with me, because one of the final signs explains why so many people mistake distance for a lack of feelings. It changes the entire picture. The first thing to understand is something that completely changes the way most people view avoidant behavior. Avoidant people rarely pursue someone in the obvious ways most of us expect. We've been taught that genuine interest looks dramatic: constant messages, emotional confessions, romantic gestures, persistent efforts to win someone back. But that usually isn't how an avoidant responds. Their pursuit is much quieter because it comes from an ongoing inner conflict. The closer they begin feeling emotionally connected, the stronger their fear of being hurt, rejected, or losing their independence becomes. As those fears grow, they instinctively create distance. That withdrawal doesn't always mean their feelings disappeared. Very often, it's a reaction to emotions becoming too intense to comfortably handle. The surprising part is that the desire itself doesn't simply fade away. Instead of moving directly toward you, they often continue seeking connection from a safer distance where they feel emotionally protected. Imagine a cautious animal that desperately wants to come closer but hesitates every time it gets near. It circles nearby, staying close enough to maintain a connection while avoiding the vulnerability that comes with stepping fully forward. That's often what pursuit looks like for someone with an avoidant attachment style. It's careful, indirect, and incredibly easy to misunderstand if you don't know what you're looking for. And that's why the next sign catches so many people off guard. One of the clearest signs appears through unexpected reappearances. Maybe you've finally accepted the silence. You've started focusing on yourself, rebuilding your life, perhaps even opening your heart to someone new. Then, without any warning, your phone lights up. It could be a simple message saying, "This made me think of you." Maybe they react to an old social media post or quietly interact with something you shared weeks or even months earlier. On the surface, these actions may seem completely ordinary, but for someone with an avoidant attachment style, these small gestures often represent a much bigger emotional step than most people realize. Instead of jumping back into deep conversations, they're carefully testing whether it feels emotionally safe to reconnect. They're checking the emotional temperature without exposing themselves to too much vulnerability all at once. When they originally pulled away, it wasn't necessarily because they had stopped caring. More often, the emotional intensity became overwhelming, and creating distance felt like the safest choice. Yet during that time apart, they may have continued replaying conversations, remembering shared experiences, and quietly wondering how you were doing. So when they finally reach out again, even through something that appears almost insignificant, it can be their quiet way of opening the door without admitting how much you've remained on their mind. Their pursuit rarely announces itself loudly. Instead, it hides inside casual conversations, understated messages, and seemingly effortless interactions. What looks like indifference from the outside may actually be a carefully controlled attempt to reconnect while protecting themselves from the emotional risk they fear the most. What they're really trying to discover is whether the connection still exists. Is there still an opening? Is there still room for them in your life without having to openly expose how vulnerable they feel? This is one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidant behavior. Avoidant people often pursue through observation rather than direct action. Instead of openly reaching out, they quietly watch from a distance. They may regularly view your stories without leaving any reaction. They might check your profile late at night, keeping up with your life while remaining completely invisible. This usually isn't about invading your privacy. More often, it's the safest way they know to maintain a sense of connection without exposing themselves emotionally. Over time, you may begin noticing small patterns. They rarely miss your updates, yet they only interact occasionally. Perhaps they unexpectedly like a photo, leave a short comment after weeks of silence, or share something that reminds both of you of a meaningful memory. Individually, these actions seem minor, but together they allow them to remain quietly present in your world while keeping their emotional walls firmly in place. That's the difficult contradiction many avoidant people live with. The distance they create to protect themselves doesn't erase their curiosity or their emotional attachment. While stepping back from vulnerability, they're often quietly making sure you haven't disappeared from their life completely. Their presence feels almost invisible because staying nearby feels much safer than fully stepping back into the relationship. Keep watching because the next behavior is even easier to overlook. Another common way avoidant people quietly pursue someone is through nostalgia. Instead of directly saying, "I've been thinking about you," they often communicate through shared memories. They may post a song that once meant something special to both of you. They could mention a restaurant, a vacation spot, or an experience that only the two of you would immediately recognize. Sometimes these moments appear completely random, but underneath them often lies real emotional significance. For someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability, openly admitting they miss you can feel overwhelming. Revisiting familiar memories feels much safer. Those small reminders become quiet invitations for you to remember the connection without requiring them to openly express their feelings. It's almost like leaving emotional breadcrumbs behind. As you notice those familiar references, old emotions naturally begin returning. Before long, you're remembering moments you shared together, and there's a strong chance they've been revisiting those same memories as well. Their longing doesn't disappear. It simply hides beneath carefully chosen actions that reveal just enough while protecting the deeper emotions underneath. Sometimes this even appears through what seem like accidental encounters. They unexpectedly show up at places they know you visit, reconnect through mutual friends, or send a message about something unrelated that quietly links back to your shared history. On the surface, these interactions seem casual. Underneath them, they often reflect the ongoing battle between fear and desire. Part of them wants to reconnect. Another part is still afraid of everything that reconnecting might require emotionally. Perhaps the least visible form of pursuit happens entirely inside the avoidant person. After creating distance, many spend much more time reflecting than anyone around them realizes. They may begin reading about relationships and attachment patterns. Some start writing in journals as they try to understand their emotional reactions. Others quietly begin counseling or therapy, hoping to make sense of the cycles that keep repeating throughout their lives. Most people never witness this private process. From the outside, it may appear as though they've simply moved on without looking back. In reality, they could be doing some of the hardest emotional work of their lives completely out of sight. They may spend months questioning their choices, examining old fears, and slowly recognizing how their own protective habits have affected people they genuinely cared about. This inner work rarely produces dramatic announcements or immediate changes. Instead, it unfolds quietly over time. And when real growth begins happening, it often becomes one of the strongest signs that the connection mattered far more deeply than they were ever able to express with words. Sometimes the greatest pursuit isn't loud, obvious, or immediate. Sometimes it begins with the silent decision to become someone who is finally capable of loving without constantly running away. As they slowly gain greater self-awareness and emotional understanding, they often become more willing to reconnect. When they eventually return, you may notice subtle but meaningful differences. Their responses become more thoughtful. They're willing to have conversations they once avoided. They ask questions that reveal genuine curiosity instead of keeping everything on the surface. Their emotional walls aren't completely gone, but small openings begin to appear where there were once only barriers. This isn't always a calculated strategy or an attempt to manipulate your emotions. Quite often, it's the natural result of someone who has quietly been confronting their own fears and is cautiously testing whether they're finally capable of building the connection they once struggled to maintain. What they're truly searching for isn't a return to the relationship exactly as it was before. Instead, they're hoping for a different kind of connection, one that feels emotionally safer and less overwhelming. Deep down, they want to believe they can experience closeness without feeling trapped or exposed. As they gradually become more emotionally prepared, their quiet attempts to reconnect become easier to recognize. What once felt like vague signals slowly begins turning into genuine communication. One of the most confusing aspects of an avoidance pursuit is the constant inconsistency. At one moment, they seem fully present. They open up emotionally, share personal thoughts, make future plans, and create the impression that things are finally moving forward. Then, almost without warning, they disappear again. The silence returns, leaving you questioning what changed and wondering whether you did something wrong. In many cases, it isn't about anything you did. What you're witnessing is their internal emotional defense system responding to increasing intimacy. As the relationship begins feeling safer and more emotionally significant, their instinctive fear of vulnerability can suddenly take over. They move closer when they feel comfortable, then instinctively create distance once the emotional intensity reaches a level they struggle to manage. This push and pull pattern isn't always intended to confuse or manipulate someone. More often, it's the way they cautiously explore emotional closeness without becoming overwhelmed. Every cycle allows them to test their own comfort zone. If their feelings remain genuine and they're actively working through their fears, you'll often notice something encouraging over time. The moments of connection begin lasting longer. The periods of withdrawal gradually become less extreme. Understanding this shift helps you interpret their behavior differently. Rather than seeing every mixed signal as a calculated game, you may begin recognizing it as someone with a guarded heart, slowly learning how to remain emotionally present. What often draws them back isn't pressure or persuasion, it's consistency. They're deeply affected by someone who remains emotionally grounded, communicates calmly, and creates space without forcing intimacy. That quiet emotional stability becomes incredibly attractive because it offers something they rarely experience: a relationship that feels safe instead of overwhelming. Even after creating significant distance, they're often pulled back toward the person who consistently offered understanding without chasing or demanding. There's another reality about avoidant behavior that surprises many people. Ironically, they're often most likely to pursue you after you've stopped pursuing them. At first glance, this seems backwards, but it reflects how many avoidants process emotional closeness. When you stop centering your life around them, invest your energy back into yourself, and genuinely begin rebuilding your own happiness, something shifts. Your emotional independence removes the pressure they once associated with the relationship. Instead of fearing expectations or feeling emotionally crowded, they begin seeing someone who is secure within themselves. That sense of emotional freedom often sparks their curiosity. Without warning, they may begin reaching out again. They ask how you've been. They share updates about their own life. Conversations that once felt impossible suddenly become easier to start. Distance, oddly enough, creates the emotional safety they often need before moving towards someone again. If you've ever wondered why an avoidance seems to come back only after you've finally started moving forward, this is often the reason. Their initial withdrawal was usually driven by self-protection, but once they recognize that the emotional pressure has disappeared, reconnecting no longer feels as threatening. Instead of you chasing them, they quietly begin circling back toward you. Another subtle way avoidants reconnect is through unconscious mirroring. As they continue thinking about someone they care about, they may naturally begin adopting certain habits, expressions, or interests that remind them of that relationship. You might notice them using familiar phrases you often said, developing a similar sense of humor, or showing interest in activities the two of you once enjoyed together. In many cases, this isn't deliberate. It's an unconscious reflection of emotional attachment. Recreating pieces of the connection allows them to feel emotionally close without directly admitting how much that relationship still matters to them. One final piece of the puzzle that often goes unnoticed is guilt. After creating distance or ending a relationship, many avoidants quietly wrestle with remorse. They wonder whether they caused unnecessary pain or pushed away someone who genuinely cared about them. Rather than openly expressing those feelings, they often check in from a distance. Perhaps they ask mutual friends how you're doing. Maybe they quietly react to a post showing that you're doing well, or find indirect ways to confirm that you're okay. Their motivation isn't always simple curiosity. Sometimes they're searching for reassurance that the relationship they stepped away from wasn't permanently damaged. Seeing you happy can ease some of the guilt they carry, while also reminding them of the connection they once struggled to protect. In their own quiet way, these small actions often become another expression of the pursuit they find so difficult to communicate directly. That reassurance gradually lowers their emotional defenses, making it easier for them to move closer, one careful step at a time. The deeper you understand avoidant behavior, the more you realize that emotional safety is what they're truly pursuing. Their instinct to create distance is usually an attempt to protect themselves from rejection, disappointment, or feeling emotionally overwhelmed. But when they experience someone who remains calm, emotionally steady, and doesn't react with pressure or hostility, something begins to shift. That sense of security becomes incredibly attractive. Instead of withdrawing completely, they may begin revealing small pieces of themselves. They might share a personal thought they would normally keep hidden, express a feeling they rarely put into words, or suggest meeting for coffee without making a big announcement about it. These gestures may appear insignificant to others, but for an avoidant, they often represent meaningful progress. If you've maintained healthy boundaries while continuing to respect yourself, you've created an environment that feels emotionally safe rather than emotionally demanding. That combination is often difficult for an avoidant to forget. They remember the stability, acceptance, and peace they experienced around you, and their quiet pursuit becomes an attempt to reconnect with that feeling while still protecting their sense of control. This isn't the dramatic kind of pursuit we often see in movies or romantic stories. It's a quiet psychological struggle where fear and longing exist at the same time, each constantly pulling in opposite directions. Another interesting pattern appears in the timing of their return. People with an avoidant attachment style often seem to come back only after you've reached a place of emotional healing. They rarely reappear while emotions are at their highest or when everything feels chaotic. Instead, they often return once life has become calmer and you've started feeling like yourself again. This isn't always a calculated attempt to manipulate you. For many avoidant people, emotional stability makes reconnecting feel much safer. They naturally avoid situations filled with conflict, pressure, or overwhelming emotion. So just as you've rebuilt your confidence, accepted what happened, and begun moving forward, an unexpected message suddenly appears. At first, it feels like an incredible coincidence, but from their perspective, they may have quietly waited until the emotional atmosphere no longer felt threatening. Their timing becomes another indirect way of saying they're ready to reconnect without having to explain the fears that caused them to leave in the first place. Stay with me, because the next sign separates genuine effort from temporary emotion. One of the strongest signs that an avoidant person is sincerely trying to reconnect isn't dramatic emotion, it's quiet consistency. Rather than overwhelming you with big promises or emotional speeches, they begin showing up through small but meaningful actions. They call when they said they would. They start sharing details about their daily life. They initiate conversations instead of waiting for you to make the first move. Little by little, distance is replaced with steady presence. That's often where real progress becomes visible. Instead of relying on emotional intensity, they slowly build trust through repeated actions over time. They may never become the kind of person who expresses love through grand declarations, but they begin revealing their intentions by becoming dependable. If someone with an avoidant attachment style is genuinely trying to rebuild the connection, don't focus only on emotional moments that come and go. Pay attention to consistent patterns. Reliability tells a much more accurate story than occasional bursts of affection. Their feelings are often expressed through behavior long before they're spoken with words. Perhaps one of the most meaningful truths is this: many avoidant people aren't only pursuing the relationship itself, they're also pursuing the emotional sense of safety they experienced with you. Every time they create distance, they often discover something new about themselves, and if the connection truly mattered, it rarely disappears completely from their mind. Certain places, familiar songs, simple conversations, or completely unexpected moments can awaken memories that quietly draw them back toward what you once shared together. Long before they ever send a message or reach out, they're often reconnecting internally. Their thoughts return to familiar conversations. Dreams bring back emotions they believed had faded. Ordinary moments suddenly remind them of your presence. In many cases, the pursuit begins inside their own mind long before it becomes visible through their actions. If you were someone who consistently offered patience, understanding, and respect without trying to force emotional closeness, those experiences often leave a lasting impression. You become connected with emotional safety in their memory, and that feeling can continue pulling them back long after the relationship itself has changed. As we reach the end of this discussion, there's one final perspective that can completely change how you interpret avoidant behavior. A quiet attempt to reconnect should never automatically be viewed as manipulation. At the same time, it should never be taken as proof that every avoidant person eventually comes back. Human relationships are far too complex for simple rules. Every individual carries different life experiences, different emotional wounds, and different levels of self-awareness. Some eventually work through their fears and rebuild the connection. Others continue choosing distance because they still aren't ready to face the vulnerability that true intimacy requires. That's why the next lesson is one of the most important in this entire conversation. Never build your future around the hope that someone will eventually return. Instead, pay close attention to what they consistently do rather than what you hope they might do someday. When an avoidant person genuinely continues pursuing someone, their behavior is usually driven by an internal conflict that never completely disappears. One part of them longs for closeness, emotional security, and the comfort of feeling understood. Another part fears rejection, emotional dependence, and the possibility of being deeply hurt. Those two forces constantly compete inside them, creating the push and pull dynamic that so many people experience. Their periods of distance don't always mean their feelings have disappeared. Very often, those moments of withdrawal reflect their struggle with emotional vulnerability rather than a complete loss of interest. Creating space becomes their way of reducing emotional pressure, even if that distance causes pain for both people involved. At the same time, the desire for connection usually remains. It simply changes the way it is expressed. Instead of making dramatic declarations or openly asking for another chance, many avoidant people move carefully. They observe from a distance, reconnect through small conversations, or slowly test whether it feels emotionally safe to approach again. Their actions may seem subtle, but beneath those small gestures often exists a genuine desire to reconnect while protecting themselves from overwhelming emotional risk. And that's exactly why actions matter more than assumptions. If you ever find yourself in this kind of relationship, remember something many people forget. It is not your responsibility to heal someone else's attachment wounds. You cannot love another person into emotional readiness, and you cannot force someone to become comfortable with vulnerability before they decide to do that work themselves. No amount of patience, reassurance, or sacrifice can replace the personal growth they must choose on their own. Your responsibility is to protect your own emotional well-being. Keep building a life that brings you peace, whether they return or not. Maintain healthy boundaries that reflect your values. Invest your energy in your own growth, your goals, your friendships, and your emotional stability. The healthiest relationships are built between two people who freely choose one another, not between one person endlessly waiting while the other remains emotionally unavailable. Most importantly, allow actions to speak louder than possibilities. Hope can sometimes convince us to ignore reality, but consistent behavior always tells the clearer story. If someone truly wants to rebuild a relationship, you'll gradually notice greater consistency, increased emotional openness, accountability for past choices, and a genuine commitment to creating something healthier than before. Those are the signs that deserve your attention. Silence by itself doesn't always mean the story has ended forever. Sometimes silence is simply the space someone needs to face fears they've been avoiding for years. Real growth often happens in private, long before anyone else can see it. For some avoidant people, that period of distance eventually leads to greater emotional awareness and a healthier approach to love and intimacy. But whether they return should never become the foundation of your happiness. Your peace should never depend on another person's emotional timeline. And if life eventually brings the two of you together again, the healthiest reunion won't be built on anxiety, uncertainty, or endless chasing. It will be built on mutual understanding, emotional maturity, accountability, respect, and two people who have learned that lasting love is not sustained by fear or emotional distance. It grows through trust, consistency, honesty, and the courage to remain emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. That is the kind of relationship truly worth waiting for. Not because someone finally came back, but because both people became capable of building something they simply couldn't create before. And in the end, that's the difference between repeating old patterns and creating a connection strong enough to last.